Put this then on a belt around your thigh underneath your clothing.
If the disciples did leave everything behind to follow Jesus, even something as fundamental as finding food could be a problem. There's a clue in the Bible as to how they fed themselves. In one story, they are said to take grain from a field. This may sound as though the disciples turned into thieves, but Jewish law made provision for the poor, including travelers.
If you have a field, because you're a landowner, and you're harvesting the field, you have to leave bits with the sort of the corner of the field untouched so that the poor can come and collect from it.
One of the most important things that you have to do in ancient Judaism is practice hospitality. And part of the reason for this is very simple. You're at the mercy of people when you're traveling. There are no hotels, there are no inns, there are no nothing. So both in Jewish law and in Jewish custom, you practice hospitality.
When they traveled, the disciples left behind more than their livelihoods. Many had other responsibilities.
Most of the disciples seem to have been married. We certainly know that Peter was married. And I think it would have been very difficult for his wife and children left behind. The disciples were the people who brought in the money. They were the ones who caught the fish or who worked on the land. And I think it would have left the families in very, very difficult circumstances.
However, we may be wrong to assume that once they left, they never returned.
We have a number of references to them going out, and it couldn't be more than a few days, and then they come back again. So I don't think we should picture it as a lot of the movies and popular books have the idea. He's always on the road, day and night, just traveling from the day he starts till the day he dies. There's lots of time in between.
The disciples and Jesus may have gone home at night.
We do have the story of Peter, who's called by Jesus. He leaves everything, and then only a few verses later, he's going to have tea with his mother-in-law. And so that gives the impression that maybe the break, at least in the early period when Jesus' ministry was located in Galilee, maybe the break wasn't quite so clear-cut as we're often led to believe.
As Jesus' ministry grew, there were occasions when the disciples had to travel well beyond Galilee. On these journeys, they really did have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. But it's a little-known fact that the disciples had something to offer in return. Something that was much sought after and rarely available.
When we dig up tombs, most people in the tombs in their 40s and 50s when they die. And the mortality rates look like they do for third world nations today, because after all, a very ordinary infection could simply kill you because they had no way to deal with that.
There was no formal health system in first-century Galilee. Villagers depended on local healers who had developed home cures that seemed to work. Jesus had a big reputation as a healer, but so too did his disciples.
If they went to a village, they seemed to have two main tasks. One was to announce the kingdom of God was upon you. The other was to heal the sick. And if they successfully healed the sick, then they could have their daily bread. They might have a place to lay their heads.
The fact that the disciples could heal should not come as a surprise. Faith healing has a long history. For centuries, it was the only healing people had.
It's not at all unusual to pray to the gods if you're a pagan, or to God if you're a Jew, for healing. That's absolutely acceptable. And people who specialize in praying to God for healing are also very well known. But delivering healing and delivering it in association with a religious movement would be perfectly understandable and acceptable.
Now modern medicine may be able to explain how it can work.
so we need to go higher and lateral.
In Houston, Texas, surgeon Bruce Mosley treats patients with arthritic knee pain. In a recent experiment, he treated 3 different groups. All patients were taken down to the operating room and had incisions made in the knee. But only the first group received routine surgery. The second group had a smaller operation, and the third had no treatment at all. The results of the experiment were quite remarkable.
They all improved. They all got benefit from the surgery. They all reported less pain. They all reported improved function, and they were all very satisfied. But interestingly, the pretend surgery group did just as well as the real surgery groups.
Tim Perez was one of Dr. Mosley's first patients.
Well, I could be walking and a sharp pain would hit my knee, and it give, you know, when you're in pain, you just don't have no strength at all.
Tim was in the group that had no surgery, but his knee got better. That was 8 years ago, and Tim still feels better.
And I call that a miracle because it's something that didn't take no medicine, didn't take nothing to heal it. So it had to be the mind.
In medical terms, Tim was part of the placebo group, which means he didn't receive a real treatment. Physicians are now closer than ever to understanding how the placebo effect works.
I think the placebo works through a psychological or an emotional impact that a treatment has on a patient. And it ties into what the patient's expectations and beliefs are. If the patient expects and believes that a treatment's going to be effective, it almost certainly will. And now hands in front, up over your head as high as you can go. Okay.
And if people today can get better because they believe in the doctor's ability to cure them, maybe the same was happening back in the first century. Dr. Mosley still believes God was involved in the disciples' healing, but he does not discount the importance of the patient's belief that they can be cured.
You can certainly draw parallels between what Jesus and the disciples were doing and what a doctor does today. In both situations, they have a belief that the healer is going to help them. And you could certainly imagine that some of the benefit that the ancient healers have had is from a placebo effect.
In part, thanks to their ability to heal, Jesus and the disciples began to attract larger and larger crowds. But for all the good work the disciples did, healing could be a deeply frustrating experience. The Bible tells us that sometimes they just couldn't do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story of a man who brings his son to Jesus, and the son is exhibiting symptoms we would call epilepsy. And he complains the disciples had failed to heal his son. Well, Jesus does heal the son. Later on, the disciples come and say, well, why couldn't we do it? What was the problem? And Jesus says, it was your lack of faith.
The reference to the disciples' lack of faith rings true with modern doctors. Physician Bruce Mosley believes that even today, the amount of confidence a doctor has in his treatment can affect the outcome.
If the surgeon has a high expectation and a faith that their treatment's going to have a benefit, then I believe that the patients can realize that. They can feel that. They can sense that. And the more confident the surgeon is, then I'm sure the more confident the patient is that that treatment's going to work.
But the disciples' occasional inability to heal may have been symptomatic of a more fundamental problem. To have complete faith in Jesus as a leader, the disciples needed to share his vision, and for much of the time, they appeared to do so. But a closer examination of the Gospels reveals that the disciples did not always have the same outlook as their leader. Indeed, there's evidence of underlying tensions and disagreements flaring up in public. One instance is when Jesus tells his disciples to take their message to the Samaritans. Today, the word Samaritan describes a do-gooder, but to a first-century Jew, he was the enemy.
If Jesus told me we had to go through Samaria, my heart would sink. I would say, oh no, we've had hostility between us and the Samaritans for 500 years, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better.
The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was a very difficult one. It seems to have gone back to a problem over what was the proper site for the temple. The Samaritans said that the sacred site should be on their holy mountain, whereas the Jews said that the holy site should be in Jerusalem.
Samaritan villagers were not interested in what these Jewish preachers had to say, and they threw the disciples out. Instead of acting with humility, the disciples were furious. It was a flagrant breach of Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. James and John were so angry, they wanted to send down fire on the village and obliterate it.
I think today we would see this as a kind of a racism, but it's even more than racism. If you think about what they were really saying, they were saying, let's kill these people.
Whereas Jesus says, no, that's not the way he works. He'll offer them salvation, but if they don't accept it, that's up to them. And he simply goes on to another place.
The disciples were not just at odds with Jesus. On more than one occasion, the Bible says they argue between themselves about which of them is the greatest. James and John even asked Jesus if they can have thrones next to his in the new kingdom.
I think this shows that there's a lot more competitiveness and rivalry between them than we often think. In many ways, this is only to be expected because first-century society was full of squabbles over honour and shame and status. And so in this, the disciples are really just behaving like typical first-century men.
These squabbles may have been typical, but according to psychologist Carey Cooper, they could escalate into damaging power struggles.
We have in almost all groups a James and a John. And the reason I say that is because they're a bit fiery, a bit revolutionary, but I think that they actually kind of want a leadership role. I think they're people who one has to manage quite carefully, otherwise their innate needs for leadership or to be in a position of influence or to be rebellious will get in the way.
The disciples managed to keep their differences in check, most of the time. But on one occasion, these divisions threatened the very survival of the movement. A woman came in and poured expensive perfume over Jesus. The disciples were not impressed.
The disciples are annoyed that this woman has wasted this oil on Jesus. They say she should have taken it away, she should have sold it and given the money to the poor. But Jesus sees things quite differently. He says she's done a beautiful thing.
As treasurer of the group, Judas seems particularly upset by this act. Every group has disagreements, but the consequences of Judas's reaction were catastrophic. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew say Judas goes to the religious authorities to talk about leading them to Jesus. But for now, the other disciples appear to know nothing